If Yahweh is an all-powerful and loving God, it seems very counterintuitive that he would create us on earth where there is suffering, or at least the potential for suffering. Why couldn't he have created us in heaven where we are told everything is awesome all of the time?
Heaven is still going to have A, free will, and B, no sin. But then why in the world didn't God just start us out in heaven? Like, what is the point of all of this suffering and moral evil on earth?
Free will is commonly the explanation apologists use to explain why sin and evil exist. Some apologists will say that there is no free will without sin, but how can that be the case if heaven preserves free will but is nonetheless sinless? Also, if Yahweh is sinless, how can he have free will? How does a Christian square these things with the idea that free will leads inevitably to sin?
Here's a more theological way of framing this question. If God foreknew what was going to happen, why didn't he create a new heaven and a new earth from the beginning and forego this world of suffering? Now, before we even look at responses, we have to remember that questions are not arguments. Asking why God wouldn't do X is not an argument that Christianity is false. And don't get me wrong, I think that these are really good questions. I think that they're questions that deserve an answer. But not having an answer doesn't in any way mean that God doesn't exist. That's just not how it works.
You can rephrase a lot of these gotcha questions as arguments. Instead of asking why an omnipotent and loving God didn't create us in heaven, you could say a loving, omnipotent God would create us in heaven, but we aren't in heaven, therefore we were not created by a loving and omnipotent God. It's a pretty simple modus tollens.
The first reason is that in general, it's just an extremely great good that people can choose to be in heaven. Now, I say in general because obviously not everyone has this chance. But in general, being able to choose to love God and enter into a relationship with him is a great good.
Why would creating us in heaven take away that choice? Why couldn't we be created in heaven, and if some folks don't like it, they can choose to go to hell if they want?
Suppose that a scientist, like a mad scientist, came up with some kind of love serum that could make anybody you want fall in love with you. Like, it might be fun to dream or think about using this serum on somebody, but would you actually want to use it? Wouldn't forced love be less valuable than actual genuine love from someone coming to love you on their own volition? I mean, if you think about it, would a relationship based on a love serum be love at all? The answer is clearly no.
Why would being created in heaven force anyone to love a God? I thought we were supposed to have free will in heaven, so how would being there force anyone to do anything? Also, since when is love a choice? Imagine how many divorces could be prevented if people could simply choose to fall back in love with a spouse for whom they no longer have the same feelings. You can't just choose to love or not love someone, and that fact doesn't make love any less love or any less valuable.
The second reason shines light on the unthinkable goodness of what Jesus did on the cross for us. I mean, sacrificing yourself for your loved ones or people that love you back is a really, really fantastic good. But sacrificing yourself for people that reject you and don't want anything to do with you, can you even imagine a greater act of love than that? And if you can, if you can think of a greater act of love, I seriously want to see it. Write it down in the comments and let me know. But notice that none of this can happen, what Jesus did on the cross. It can't happen without the existence of sin. Jesus can't save us or sacrifice himself for us if we don't need any saving.
That's like letting your children drink turpentine so you can heroically donate your kidneys to them when their kidneys fail. No matter how much suffering you put yourself through to save someone from danger, it isn't heroic if you put them in that danger to begin with. If Yahweh exposed us to sin, then it isn't heroic for him to save us from it. And again, this assumes that if people were created in heaven, they wouldn't have the free will to sin.
All right, so the third reason is that heaven has a lot of great goods, but so does a world with suffering. And since God wasn't forced to choose one over the other, he created a world that has both. And this immediately raises a really interesting question. What types of goods could come out of a world with suffering? One that I like to think about a lot is called what I'll call character development. Put simply, suffering aids in building our character. When someone hurts us or causes us to suffer, for example, we're given the opportunity to forgive them. And it's really up to us, as long as you think we have free will, it's really up to us if we decide to do that.
This is like saying if we lived in a world without disease, we wouldn't have invented all these great medicines. If there were no more disease and we stopped using medicines, I wouldn't say, gee, I sure do miss all those great medicines we used to use. If there's no reason to use those medicines, I wouldn't care about the medicines, no matter how great they are. Similarly, if everyone stopped mistreating each other, I can't see myself saying, gosh, I sure do miss being stabbed in the back and then forgiving people for it. That's absurd.
And so the way that we respond to suffering in this life really does form our character in really significant ways. King David, for example, wouldn't have been the same person had he not faced Goliath. In Romans 5, Paul says this, "We rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope." James expresses a similar sentiment in the first chapter of his epistle. "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything."
Again, this is all wishing for problems so we have a reason to employ solutions. It's inane to suggest that this is in any way better than not having the problems in the first place.
So the Bible confirms that suffering builds character. But now some other questions arise, like what happens to children in childbirth? Right? They don't have the opportunity to build their characters. Well, it's true that children that die young aren't really given the opportunity to build their character on earth. There's no real good reason to think that character building suddenly stops in heaven.
If that's the case, then we didn't need to be created on earth in order to do it, did we?
But if suffering can go on in heaven, you might think, then why not just create everyone in heaven? I mean, it seems like we're back at square one here. But this is all just way, way, way too quick. On Christianity, the suffering that we experience on earth will ultimately be defeated in the afterlife.
Then how can we continue building character in the afterlife?
So it's not a matter of God having to choose like one over the other. Evil is defeated either way. And it's also important to note that the character development that goes on in heaven is different than the type of character development that goes on earth.
So then the infants don't get the benefit of the earthly type of character development?
And it's not that one is like better than the other one, they're just different.
If the character development that goes on in heaven is just as good, then what's the point of doing it on earth where it exposes people to suffering?
As an analogy, it's great that a lot of animals use eyesight to survive, but it's also great that bats use sonar. And it's not that like eyesight is better necessarily than sonar. They're both good in their own unique ways. Like it'd make really little sense to say that since sight and sonar are so different that God shouldn't have created bats. Likewise, character development is different on heaven than it is on earth, but that doesn't mean that God shouldn't have created earth.
Since heaven can give us character development that's just as good as that which we can get on earth, but without the suffering, what's the point of exposing us to the suffering? You obviously can't argue suffering builds character as a defense of suffering if you can build character in heaven without the suffering. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.